Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. In this session, we will continue on the human capital investment. We will now discuss education as a signal. This is an alternative model to understand the importance of human capital investment. In our earlier discussion, we are focusing on the importance of education to improve workers' productivity. By having good education, workers are improving their skills and knowledge. They become more productive, and productive workers therefore receive better earnings. An alternative to that idea is the following discussion. Education only functions as a signal to employers. Let's first understand the signaling model of education. The following are the basis of schooling model. As I have mentioned earlier, education would increase productivity, and increase in productivity raises wages. That's the model that we have discussed earlier. The alternative model is to see education as a signal. What it means is education increases earnings not because of productivity, but it signals or certifies that certain type of workers is cut out for certain types of jobs. This is the main argument, considering that certain level of qualification is a good signal for potential employers to separate workers in terms of who are fit to fill in certain vacancies. In this context, we are considering the level of qualification would be a good signal for employers to separate workers. For example, employers could separate between low productivity workers and high productivity workers. To understand the purpose of education as a signal, let's consider the following table. In this table, we group two workers into two types. The first one are those workers considered as low productivity workers, and the second type is the high productivity workers. The second column here shows the proportion out of the population that belongs to these two groups. So we consider that Q is the percentage or proportion out of the population whom we consider to be the low productivity workers, and the remaining of that 1 minus Q is the high productivity groups. And let's consider that if employers could separate these two groups, they will pay the low productivity workers as indicated by the third column, where the third column shows the present value of lifetime productivity. So let's consider that the present value of lifetime productivity for the low productivity workers are $200,000, and for the high productivity workers, they would receive $300,000. Now let's consider the following points. First, let's make the assumption. We assume that the productivity differences between the two types of workers exist since birth and has nothing to do with their years of schooling. In other words, productivity level is something we can consider as the innate abilities. It is given at birth. And we assume that years of school has nothing to do with the worker's productivity. The question we are interested to know is, how then employers can know who are the low productivity workers and who are the high productivity workers? In the absence of credible information about the workers, an employer then would pool the workers. The third point here argues that when employers cannot identify who are the low productivity and high productivity workers, they would resort to pool the workers into one category. And therefore, in that case, the employers would consider the average salary and productivity as follows. The average salary is given by 200,000 times Q. Q is the proportion of the population who are the low productivity workers, plus 300,000 times this term tells us the proportion of population who are the high productivity workers. And solving this equation would give us the following: 300,000 minus 100,000 Q. And this solution means that the high productivity workers would not be happy with this pool equilibrium solution. If this is how employers decide on how to pay their workers, when employers cannot separate between the low productivity and high productivity workers, we find that the low productivity workers would be happy with this solution, because going back to this table, this is the low productivity workers. If we assume that the value of Q is equal to 0.5, that means half of the population, they are the low productivity workers. In this case, we'll find that the low productivity workers would get 300,000 minus 50,000, so they will have $250,000. And in that case, we will find that under the pool equilibrium solution, the low productivity workers would be happy with that solution. On the other hand, the high productivity workers would not be happy with that, because they receive less than the amount had the employers be able to separate these two groups according to their level of productivity. This is one case when there is no clear signal, employers resort to a pool equilibrium. Therefore, the pooled equilibrium solution means that the low productivity workers would prefer the pool equilibrium solution. High productivity workers would not be happy with it because they receive less than what they should be. Employers also would not be happy with the pool equilibrium solution because they are not rewarding the workers according to their contribution. So what's the best solution? This is where schooling as a signal is important. Now let's understand schooling as a signal. Education means a level of attainment. Years of schooling would means a level of attainment, which signals a worker's qualifications or innate ability to potential employers. The qualification of a worker would provide a credible information that can be used by employers to allocate workers in the labor market according to what they are fit to do. And therefore, in this context, education functions as a signal. When employers take years of schooling, for example, as a signal, this would function as a separating equilibrium. What it means is, now employers can identify the low productivity workers and also the high productivity workers based on their level of education. Assuming that the low productivity workers choose not to obtain certain years of schooling, or in this case, X years of schooling. And this would therefore become a voluntary signaling from this type of workers, indicating that they are the low productivity group. On the other hand, in the context of a high productivity workers, they will choose to get at least X years of schooling, and by having X years of schooling and more, then this group would separate themselves from the low productivity workers. To understand further this idea of education as a signal, let's consider the following diagram. There are two types of workers as we have mentioned earlier: the low productivity workers as shown by diagram A, and the high productivity workers indicated by diagram B. Consider the first type of workers, the low productivity workers. If you look at this diagram should be familiar to you now. Basically, it shows the schooling stream for these workers, where in this case, this line is the stream path indicating the present value of earnings for workers with only high school qualification. And on the other hand, this path is the present value of earnings for workers who obtain, let's say, college education or university degree. In this model, we find that Y bar is the years of schooling where employers would decide who are the low productivity workers and who are the high productivity workers. And let's consider obtaining Y bar years of schooling means the workers have a degree. That's one way how we can understand the concept of Y bar over here. Since this is a low productivity workers, this is the cost line for this worker as compared in the case of a high productivity workers indicated by diagram B. And for these workers, obtaining education is not that costly. We consider that their cost line is much flatter, indicating that it is less costly for them to obtain more years of schooling as compared to the low productivity workers. Going back to diagram A, we find that workers get paid 200,000 if they get less than Y bar years of schooling, and they will get 300,000 if they get more than Y bar year of schooling. All workers in general would like to have Y bar year of schooling. However, for the low productivity workers, they would find it is expensive or costly for them to invest in more years of schooling or to obtain Y bar year of schoolings. On the other hand, the high productivity workers do obtain Y bar years of schooling because for them it is less expensive or it is less costly. As a result of this, we find that workers voluntarily provide an essential signal to the market based on their decision to acquire certain years of schooling. This voluntary signal would enable the employers to separate between the low productivity workers and the high productivity workers. That's the basic idea. To be more specific, let's consider the case of a low productivity workers. As mentioned earlier, this is the cost associated with the low productivity workers. For them to obtain more years of schooling, it is more expensive. For example, for this worker to obtain Y bar years of schooling, each additional year of schooling would means they have to incur $25,000. As compared for the high productivity workers, each additional year of schooling would means they have to incur only $20,000 in terms of the cost. If this is the cost line for these low productivity workers, the question is why they would not obtain Y bar. To understand this diagram, first notice that workers would want to maximize the gap between the present value of earnings from the qualification obtained with respect to the cost line here. The low productivity workers are maximizing the return if they obtain only high school qualification, because this is the maximum gap between the present value of earnings given the qualification over here and the costs. With that logic, we find that for these low productivity workers, if they obtain, let's say, Y1 level of education as indicated here, this is no longer maximizing the gap between the present value of high school earning over here and this is the cost to obtain Y1. So this line, this gap here is less than this gap. This is where the low productivity workers are maximizing the return to their education investment. They only get up until high school. On the other hand, considering the high productivity workers, considering the cost line for them, we find that obtaining Y bar years of schooling is the best solution for them, because considering the present value of earnings for obtaining Y bar of schooling and the cost incurred to obtain it, which is given by this gap, this is where they are maximizing. This is more than had they only obtained the high school level of qualification. How do we know this? Maybe if we compare the gap between these two, it is not that clear. If we calculate the difference between the present value of obtaining Y bar years of schooling and the cost here, the cost here is 20,000. So 300,000 minus 20,000, the gap here is about $280,000. Basically, the gap here is about $280,000. If the workers only obtain high school, they only get 200,000 minus zero, the cost of not investing any additional year of schooling. So they only get 200,000. Therefore, we find that the gap here is maximized if the high productivity workers obtain Y bar. So I hope that's clear to you now. This is where the high productivity workers would maximize the gap between the present value of earning and the cost line here. Therefore, their best decision is to obtain Y bar. And they can afford to do this because for them, obtaining Y bar years of schooling is less costly or less expensive as compared to the low productivity workers. So this is how we can then separate between the high productivity workers and the low productivity workers. Employers would consider years of schooling as a separating signal to identify who are the low productivity workers and the high productivity workers. Now let's extend the analysis a bit further. What if the employers choose more than Y bar as another signal? Let's say this is a new signal to separate the workers. Let's say Y prime. Will the high productivity workers continue to invest up until Y prime? So now we need to make sure that the gap here, let's say this is the gap, the high productivity workers would only continue up until Y prime as long as the gap between the present value of earning by obtaining Y prime here is maximized and more than the high school qualification over here. We cannot rely on the distance shown by this diagram. We need to get some figure over here to see how much is the gap, as I have done in the calculation earlier. The point here is workers would not indefinitely continue to invest in more and more years of schooling because there will be a point when doing that will no longer provide the workers with the maximized gap between the earnings obtained and the cost incurred. So that's how years of schooling can stand as a signal to separate between these two types of workers. To conclude the discussion, we find that years of schooling can be one form of signaling. Actually, there are many other ways how education can work as a signal. Other forms of educational signals are the level of CGPA. Another signal is to look at their involvement in other curriculum activities. Which higher learning institutions you study also could be a form of signal to the employers. That's why we have League of Universities, the high-ranked universities, the middle-ranked, and the low-ranked universities. This also can be considered as signal by employers to separate the workers. However, in our model here, we only consider obtaining certain years of schooling as a form of signal. If you think that this model is a valid model, remember that now you are in the process of obtaining your degree or even your master degrees, and that can be a separating model because if you have a master degree now, you are obtaining more years of schooling. You are separating yourself from those with only a degree qualification. That's a form of signal. Not just that, your CGPA level also matters as another signal. Your curriculum activities also are important as another form of signal. From where you get your degree also is another form of signal. I hope you understand the discussion here. Inshallah, we will discuss more topics in this chapter. See you next time. Wassalam.